Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we're here for my NACL Week 6 overview, analysis, and of course, at the end, my updated power rankings. Really excited to go over this week in the NACL, obviously, back to the full schedule, all 3 days on the docket here in week number 6, and I'm excited. We're really starting to get to the nitty-gritty of the NACL. Only 2 weeks remain before we jump into spring playoffs, so teams really need to step up or shut up at this point in the season. It's really interesting. We're getting a good idea as to who the top teams, who the middle teams, and who the bottom teams are, and this week definitely showed that a little bit more. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. Of course, if you are new here, what we're going to be doing is going through all 3 days of the NACL. Up on the screen, we're going to have a scoreboard of sorts for each day. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about each series, my player of the series, my dud of the series, where I think both teams are moving in the series. And then, of course, at the end, we will do my updated power rankings going into the final week of the season. If you guys are excited for this video, let me know down in the comment section below. Who overperformed your expectations this week? Who underperformed your expectations this week? We had a lot of really fun series, and I'm going to talk about them all here, obviously, but I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback down in the comments section below. But with all that being said, let's jump right into it, of course, starting off with day number 1. And day number 1 was really interesting. This was probably the day that I think was the most clear-cut of the 3 days, at least in terms of the results, and you can see that in the most 2-0s. 5 of the 6 series were 2-0s on the screen. We're going to go series by series, starting with our first series of the week, CLG Challengers taking on AOE Gold, and it's a 1-1, our only 1-1 of the day, to be precise. And I would say it was a relatively good series overall for both teams. Not one team really looking ridiculously dominant. I would say both teams looked very good in their individual games. AOE looked really good in game number 1, and CLG looked really good in game number 2, whereas, you flip them both. AOE looked really bad in game number 2, and CLG looked really bad in game number 1. It was just two teams that kind of had a good game against each other. It was really just up to which one was going to have a better one. For me, when you're looking at player of the series and dud of the series, for series like this, where it really was just one game apiece for each player, you have to identify which player, in your opinion, had the best individual game, and for me, that was Darkwings in game number 1. Obviously, people who follow the channel know I'm a big fan of Darkwings. I have been for a while. Ever since last year, I was a really big Darkwings fan. I thought he was almost underrated by most of the community, and I thought he really stepped up in game number 1 and played really well. Certainly not going into weak competition here. Obviously, CLG Challengers is a good team, but their main player is in the mid lane, in Copy, who has been one of the best players in the NACL in 2023. So to see Darkwing step up and have such a good game, it is a good sign. I think Darkwings, Gamsu, those are the two players that I think have been a little bit up and down overall for AoE. You can talk about jungle, you can talk about bot lane being okay for the team, but when this team wins, it is usually through one of the solo laners having a really good game, and in this one, that was the case. It was Darkwings really popping off. I thought he was definitely the main man for AoE in game 1, but I would say everybody had a really good game number 1 for AoE. Everybody had a really good game number 2 for CLG. I would argue that Copy's game 2 was probably the best performance from a CLG player in this series, but we're actually sticking with AoE for my dud of the series here. It's going to go to Winnie in the jungle. Not necessarily the worst performance of all time coming out from Winnie. You can see that in the scoreline that he had, 1, 5, and 10. But it is worth noting that I think game number 2 was pretty bad overall for the tempo of AoE. I think they really had a shot in that game to be able to do something, but they were just much too slow. I thought Kevy did a really good job of being able to control the pacing of the game over a player like Winnie, and it ended up coming back to bite AoE. CLG was able to take that game number 2. They were able to get their mid and their bot super far ahead, and then the game was kind of over from that point. So, Winnie is going to get my dud of the series. I don't want to say that he's been, up and down for AoE. I think he's had some really good games, and obviously he's a very experienced player at this level, but when I look at AoE and I look at the players that have really stood out, Winnie is not really one of the players that has, jumped to mind. I think Darkwings is definitely one of them. Lynx has had some really good games. Gamsu's also had some games. It just feels like, not to say that jungle support are the roles that have kind of disappointed the most, but I feel like usually when this team loses pressure, it is through macro and not necessarily through hand stiff. A lot of the laning, the 1v1 laning or the 2v2 laning has gone relatively well for AoE. It's just, I think, the general sense of the game that sometimes they can falter on. That's not to say that the laners haven't had problems. There are some really bad Gamsu games this split. some not so good Darkwing games this split. Bot lane has definitely lost as well, but for me, Winnie's going to get the dud of the series here against CLG just for that game 2, and Darkwings is going to get player of the game for game number 1. But for CLG on the other side, it was really just exactly what I described for AoE, very similar. I think you could very realistically give player of the series to someone like Copy. I think you could very realistically give it to like Meech as well if you really wanted to for that game number 2, but I think for the most part, CLG kind of went into this with the expectation that they were going to be able to win both games, because they probably should go into a series like this with the expectation that they can win both games. They are a better team than AoE, so to see them come out in game 1 and not really play up to expectation, just a little bit disappointing. I still think that they're a solid team, but, they really are following exactly where I thought they would in the standings, which is right in the middle. They're somewhere around, like, 8. They're a good team, solid team, someone that can take games off of better teams, but this team just draws a lot. They draw a lot of games and a lot of series, and that was no more so the case than in this one. So, relatively good series overall. I would say neither team really looked out of sorts in terms of what I predicted for them going into the week. AoE maybe looking a little bit better than I expected, especially this mid lane matchup, which I thought would be super in favor of CLG, but overall, I think both teams kind of playing to expectations here. 1-1 isn't entirely out of the question for these two teams. And then we get into our second series, or I guess our congruently first series of day number 1 here. We had Team Liquid Challengers taking on Evil Geniuses Challengers, two teams that I think are relatively good on paper, but it was definitely TLC that came out on top in this one with the 2-0 series win, winning both games and looking really good doing it. Mostly the carries looking really, really good doing it. Obviously, TLC has had some really good moments over the course of the year so far. I do like how the bottom half of their map has played for most of 2023. Bradley's had some good games. I think Mira has certainly had much better games as of recently. But it's really good to see the two carry roles stepping up and being the main focal points for TLC, because that's what they really brought them in to be. You had, obviously, Arrow coming into the bot lane, hoping to be some sort of stabilizing veteran presence on this NACL team, someone who's been very good at this level for quite a long time, and then finally giving a player like APA a shot at the NACL level, and he has definitely rewarded them. He has been one of the best mid laners in the NACL. He's going to get my player of the series here. He was good in game number 1 on the Ziggs, I definitely want to point that out, but it was his game number 2 on the Ahri that really solidified player of the series for me. Obviously, he has been very vocal about wanting to get this shot in the NACL and in Academy for quite a long time. He finally gets it here with a good organization, mind you, in Team Liquid, and he really has performed. This Ahri game, especially in game 2, was really, really solid. I don't want to discredit Ryoma too much, because I actually think Ryoma played game 2 relatively well in that same vein on the Akali, but APA was just better, both playing kind of the shove and roam style, trying to find skirmishes in the mid game. Team Liquid was better at being able to play around their fed mid laner, and APA was a lot better at making the opportunities count. A lot of the trades that Ryoma was taking in the mid game were 1-for-1s. He was getting gold, but he was giving gold over to the enemy as well. APA didn't feel the need to have to trade really at all. He was just going to go in and have a really good game, and so big credit to him. He was solid, and I also want to shout out the bot lane here for TLC, which has continued to be pretty good. I'm not going to say they're like the best in the league or anything like that, because there are a ton of really good bot lanes in the NACL right now, but you got to give Arrow and Kim Down the credit that they deserve in series where they're really able to take over and be the better bot lane, especially going into, a supposed replacement bot lane in Evil Geniuses here, which we'll get into. I think, giving them the talent advantage, I think, is a big plus for TLC, and they definitely paid that off here. The Zeri game in game number 1 in particular for Arrow was really, really good. He was probably the main carry in that game number 1, but he was still really solid on the Jhin in game number 2. So big ups to APA, big ups to Arrow, and Kim Down. I think that those were the 3 players that I think stood out the most for me for TLC. On the other side, for Evil Geniuses, not a particularly great series. Like I said, some decent games coming out from Ryoma. I thought he was the one who really stepped up in game 2 and at least tried to make plays, but he was just a little bit too over-aggressive, I would say, in that game 2 to be able to win a lot of these skirmishes, but the rest of his team was definitely letting him down as well. My dud of the series is going to go to Shaden in the jungle. Everybody here knows that I'm a big fan of Shaden. How can you not be? He's ridiculously talented. He has the potential to be one of the best junglers in North America within just a year or so, if he can just get that consistency underway, but he was not particularly good in this series. Going into a jungler in Mir that I don't think has been, dominant this year by any means, I was really hoping that he was going to be able to step up and kind of take advantage of that matchup, be able to generate a lot of early pressure for Evil Geniuses. He just wasn't able to do that. He lost both sides of the Vi Wukong matchup, which is just never a good sign. And that's just what you're going to get with Shaden. You're going to get some series and some games where he's just going to be a little bit too overeager in the early parts of the game and in the mid game, and he's not going to be able to get ahead from it, and that's what we saw especially in Game 2, where Ryoma certainly had some moments where him and Shaden could team up and potentially try to make some plays around the map. Shaden was just a little bit too far behind and at times a little bit too far forward to make those plays happen, and so not a particularly good game from the Evil Geniuses jungler. And then the other player that I want to shout out for not being particularly phenomenal in the series was Smoothie, and I think obviously bot lane's had its problems. I'm going to stop mentioning King, because I have no idea what's going on with him. I don't know if he's just not going to play in spring, if they're just going to say, screw it, mobility plays all of spring, and then maybe he comes in for summer. I don't really know what's going on. Obviously, it is visa related, I do know that, but I don't know why his visa is taking so much longer than everyone else's. I would have imagined that, when, Ayla had to wait 2 months, but at the very least, he got in, right? King is still not here, so I don't really know what's going on. I'm going to talk as if mobility is the actual AD carry from this point onwards for Evil Geniuses challengers, because I don't know the situation, but their bot lane just isn't a strength, and that's okay. They're not supposed to be. Mobility, Smoothie, they're fine, but they're certainly not superstars at the position. Smoothie didn't look particularly practiced on the Annie. He was stepping up much too far, getting caught out before he could really use his combo, and it's just not a very good look. I would say that the veterans on Evil Geniuses really aren't acting like veterans right now. It's a lot of the young players that are really stepping up and being the driving force, I would say, overall for the team, maybe with the exception of Ryoma. But overall, Evil Geniuses, just not a very good team. I had them at number 1 in my preseason power rankings. That has clearly just not come to fruition. These players have not played up to that expectation. This team should be top 10. Like, if they're not top 10, that is an absolute disaster. They should be a top 10 team, but they honestly, quite frankly, are just not playing consistent enough for me to really believe in that right now. There are a lot of really good teams in the NACL, and it just feels like Evil Geniuses is kind of getting run over a bit. But as for Team Liquid on the other side, I do like this team. I still don't think they are, like, one of the best teams in the NACL right now. They still have a big uphill climb for me. They just have not shown the consistency that I think, like, the top 4-ish teams in the NACL have shown over the course of the year so far, but they're solid. APA is a really good player and has probably been their best over the course of the year, but I like Bradley a lot. Arrow and Kim Down have been solid. Mir is, playing a lot better, I think, than he did at the beginning of the year. Overall, TLC is a good team. I just don't know if I would necessarily consider them contenders to win the NACL in spring, but, this organization has surprised us before, so it could definitely happen again once we get around playoff time. Moving on now to our third series of day number 1 here, and it was another little bit of a blowout. We had Immortals Challengers taking on CLG Faith, and IMT picks up the win here. They absolutely should. No flame to CLG Faith, but they just really haven't been all that competitive this year, especially with a lot of the roster changes that are coming in mid-season. This team hasn't had a lot of time to play together as a unit, so to see Immortals come out and be able to win 2-0, I think is a good sign overall for them. This is a team that I think has looked a lot better as of recently. Some of their players have really been stepping up, in my opinion. They've been limiting a lot of the mistakes that they were making early in the year, especially top side of the map, where I felt like ADD and Chad were definitely, being a little bit too much earlier on in the season. It feels like they're definitely honing it in, I would say, a little bit over the course of the last few games. But this really was everybody on Immortals stepping up and having a really good series. My player of the series is going to go to Balulu on the side of Immortals. Really liked what he was able to do. Obviously, not going into the strongest of mid lane competitions. A player like Town was brought in specifically to replace Saradoc, who just wasn't able to play at this level. Town obviously played for CLG Faith before. We talked about him a bit last week, but Balulu came in and definitely dominated. He got his signature Zoe. Kind of not fair to not ban it against them. That's just a permaban against Immortals Challengers and against Balulu for a reason, but he was just as dominant on the Lissandra in game number 2, which is just as impressive to me. A champion that really does need, particularly most of the time, assistance to be able to pop off in that way. Not Balulu. Balulu is just going to play super aggro in lane phase against these assassins. Obviously, Lissandra really good into something like Akali. You're always going to be able to make plays on that, but for him to carry the game in the damage way that he did was really impressive. Certainly not the only player on the team to look really, really good, though. You got to give a lot of credit to the bot lane, which I think has definitely been up and down for Immortals over the course of the first few weeks, or the first, half of the season, I guess you could say. I really want to give a big shout out to Joey, who had a really good series here. Feels like Joey often gets lost in the shuffle because he's a player who's just been at this level for a very long time. He's never really been, like, the single best support in the NACL or in Academy or at this level, right? But he's always been one of the best supports at this level, and he has been for quite a long time. And another really good series coming out from him. Not to take credit away from Wixie, who I think had one of his more consistent series of the year. The positioning was on point, which is something that I think Wixie has struggled with over the beginning parts of the split. I would say Balulu and Joey, though, definitely the standouts for Immortals for me. CLG Faith on the other side, just not so good. Pretty much everybody on this team really struggling to get basically anything going in the series. My dud of the series, unfortunately, is going to go to Town. He just looked outclassed in that mid lane matchup. He was going to these more assassin-oriented picks, things like the Ahri in Game 1, things like the Akali in Game 2, and they just were not working out. Balulu obviously getting a signature Zoe in Game 1, that's a tough draw, even into something like Ahri, and then, playing Akali into Lissandra is not particularly easy when you are not super far ahead. So Town is going to get my dud of the series. It just feels, generally speaking, like CLG Faith doesn't have a lot of win conditions, and I mean that in the nicest way possible. Even when NXI pulls out something like the Kindred, like he did in game number 1, it never felt like the team was ready to play around that. The bot lane has not really been able to step up and have any sort of gigantic, meaningful performances. I just don't know where the CLG Faith team is going to win games at compared to a team like Immortals Challengers. I'm not saying that they don't have the talent, I'm just saying that it doesn't really feel like this team has the focus to be able to understand where to put their resources and where to play through. It feels like they're all just playing solo queue. They're all trying to win their own lane and then figure out what happens after. That's not really how you win at a competitive level, and that's really been shown by some of the top teams in the region so far. And so, credit to Immortals. I thought they had a really good series. There's really not a lot of analysis to do, though. They were the better team by a lot. CLG Faith is probably the worst team in the NACL right now. Definitely a relegation candidate going into the final weeks of the season, but Immortals is someone who I think could be relatively competitive at the playoff level. Obviously, everybody making playoffs, so I'm not going to sit here and say, be careful, you might miss playoffs, but Immortals definitely working their way back into the top 10. They were kind of falling out of it. They've been up and down, I would say, in that range around the entire year. This win does give me a bit more confidence, but at the end of the day, we have to understand that, quality of opponent does matter, and it's not exactly the most dominant win on the radar, but at the same time, you were at least able to do it, and you looked good doing it. It wasn't a contentious series, and that's got to count for something here. And now moving on to our fourth series of the week. It's one that I was probably most looking forward to because it's two of the most fun teams to watch in the NACL going up against each other. We had Wildcard Gaming taking on Cincinnati Fear. And Fear take it 2-0. What a win for the Fear. Really, really impressive stuff coming out from them here. Wildcard is certainly not an opponent to take lightly, but they just looked better. And they looked aggressive, and they looked dominant, and they played their style, and I can only say good things about this win because it really was a huge win for this team. Basically, everybody on the team stepping up. There was no weak link of the Fear in this one. They were a unit. They were absolutely dominating, but I would be remiss to not say that Player of the Series was a pretty easy selection here, as it's gonna go to Shochi in the mid lane. That Tryndamere game in game number 1 is one of the most disgusting things I've watched in the NACL all year. It might be the single best game of NACL action all year, basically from any player. What a ridiculous performance. Not only did he dominate the mid lane matchup, not only was he out on the map, split pushing and fighting with his team and being a huge nuisance and not actually being able to be peeled because they picked Zyra's support, but he had 400 CS. There's nothing but good things to say about Shochi's performance in game number 1 here. He was also really good in game 2 on the Sylas. I don't want to take that away, but game 1 was so destructive. It was such an easy choice for Player of the Series. Shochi now sits pretty high on the Player of the Series rankings. I think he's second to all mid laners, only behind Eminus so far this split. That's pretty good for someone who had never played at this level before. Really impressive stuff coming out from everybody on Fear, but Shochi definitely deserving Player of the Series here. Other players that I gotta point out, the bot lane just continues to play their own style and look really good doing it. They've really settled in to this kind of weak side bot. I say that in quotes. You guys can't see my quote hands, but I say that in quotes, this weak side bot of Seraphine or Jhin or something along with the Ashe support. Ashe support has been huge for the Fear all year long. Trevor plays that really, really well. I would argue that he's probably the best Ashe in the NACL, or at least from what I've seen, the best Ashe in the NACL, but the Seraphine has also been huge for Fear, and I just gotta give the bot lane a huge shout out. I mean, we're looking at a 50+ kill series overall from the Fear, and the bot lane almost had 100% KP. That is how impressive they were able to play here. Big shout out to Faisal in the top lane for that Camille game 2, where he was really destroying Moose Hater in lane. Very impressive stuff. Obviously, Moose on the Scion, not necessarily a pick that you would necessarily associate with him, but huge series overall, and then Perry just facilitating it all. There was no weak link on the Fear. Everybody stepped up and played at a very high level in this series, and that's exactly what you want to see out of the Fear moving into playoff time. But for Wildcard on the other side, This is not what you wanted to see out of them as we moved closer to playoff time. This team has certainly had its flaws moving into this part of the year, but I think a lot of them are starting to get exposed a little bit more frequently. We're seeing a lot of bans be thrown at top lane, things like the Zac, obviously the Garen being taken away from Moose Hater, and he has to resort to playing actual top laners, things like Fiora, things like Sion, that people are a lot more familiar playing against, and he hasn't been as aggressive and as dominant in that top lane matchup. That Fiora game in Game 1 in particular just wasn't particularly impressive to me, but when we're looking at, sides of the map that disappointed in this series in particular, I have to point out the bot lane. My dud of the series is going to go to Duo King in the support position. 2 games of Zyra, neither of them really worked out. I understand that you want to pick one side of the map to have this crazy off-meta pick that other people just aren't playing, but Zyra really got exposed in this series. The lane pressure just wasn't nearly there because you're going into a weak side that's okay giving up that pressure early. You're going into Seraphine, and she's going to be more than happy to just not give Zyra what she wants in the early game. It wasn't just the Zyra, obviously that was the problem, but Duo King's positioning towards the back half of teamfights, he was certainly exploitable in those moments. I also want to shout out Lens, who wasn't particularly good in this series. The Varus game in particular, in Game 2, there were certainly moments in Game 1 on the Zeri where he was able to clean up a lot of kills, but that Game 2 on the Varus was not particularly fantastic either, I would say, overall. Wildcard definitely showing some of the ways that you could potentially beat them down the line. I think target banning Moose Hater, making the rest of the team really step up and have to win games for them. They have been able to do it in the past, most specifically this jungle mid duo I think has been solid in the past, but they ran into another really good, one of the best jungle mid duos in the entire league here in Fear, and it just felt like once they got behind in a lot of these games, they didn't really have a way to catch back up. So definitely some things that I am taking a look at when it comes to Wildcard, but a really good series overall for Fear, and I think this is what we wanted to see. We wanted to see them come out. Obviously, they have one of the tougher schedules in the NACL to end off the year. They have to play basically only really good teams from this point onwards, but if we're going to start it off with a 2-0 against what most people were calling the best provisional team in the NACL, that is huge. I mean, you have proven that that is now you, and it is undisputable. This team is fantastic. Shochi's playing great. Manui's playing great. Trevor's playing great. Faisal, Perry, everyone is playing at a really high level right now, and I think we can all say that we just hope that it continues as the year goes on. Moving on to the 5th series of day number 1, though, and it's another little bit of a blowout. We saw some competitive games, at least, between the Fear and Wildcard, but series number 5, not so much. We had Cloud9 challengers taking on Team Liquid first, and C9C is just the better team by a gigantically large margin, and that was really proven in this series. C9C is just really good. You can get rid of Eminus, but you can't get rid of the rest of the talent on this team. Diplex is still fantastic, and he came in and was really good in this series, but player of the series and the big standout for me was Tomio in the jungle. Another really good series from the Cloud9 jungler. He's been really consistent over the course of the year. Maybe not the big standout jungler of the NACL up until this point, because there certainly have been a lot of good jungle performances in the NACL, but Tomio's right up there with any of them. His ability to enable a lot of what the rest of this team wants to do has been incredible, but he finally got the chance to take over and really shine as the facilitator in this one. 2 games of Vi. Always talk about this. If you're going to play Vi, you kind of need to be the better team because you need to be able to generate those early leads. The Vi has to be able to be successful in the early game so that she doesn't just get entirely blown up in the late game. Luckily, Cloud9's definitely better than TLF here, and that was proven. Tomio with some really, really good plays. Spent a lot of time in the mid lane trying to get that Kassadin ahead in game number 1. It absolutely worked. And then game number 2, some really good plays alongside the Renekton in the early game to really solidify that early game for Cloud9. Overall, just a really good series from the jungler, and, hope he can keep this up. I love Tomio as a player, and it's good to see him perform well here. Also, got to point out the 2 solo laners because they were the other members that I think really stood out for Cloud9 in this one. Diplex on the Kassadin and on the Swain in game number 2. Really efficient. He's not Eminus in the way that he wants to play the game, but this team doesn't really need him to be Eminus. They have carries. Fake God can win games. Tomio looked great here. We know that Lost can carry. This team absolutely has the talent to be able to just kind of win the games without this superstar mid laner, and that's really showing up here. But Diplex is, still one of the best mid laners in the NACL. It is pretty clear that even though his laning in the early game isn't exactly ridiculously dominant, he is a really smart player macro-wise, and he has a really good sense for where he needs to be in the mid game. And I would argue that that's just as important. That's arguably, in my opinion, the most important trait that a mid laner can have in the current meta. So really good stuff coming out from him. And then big shout out to Fake God on the Renekton here in game number 2. Really, really fun performance from him. But solo laners, jungle, really stepping up for Cloud9. We know the bot lane's been playing well. They're just a really good team, probably the best in the NACL. As for TLF, they're just not very good. Some of the roster movements, I guess, have not worked out. I really don't know what the deal is with Mia. I don't know if it was a voluntary step back. If it was, great, get your mind right. If you want to come back for playoffs, great. If not, that's cool too. You work on yourself first, always. I'm going to say that for every single player who comes through any sort of professional scene. But LJX coming in has just not been an adequate replacement. A really bad series from him. He's going to get done in the series again here. 0-8-0. Did not contribute to a single kill on the side of TLF in either game this series. It's just not very good. Aspect was also really not very good for TLF. Those two have been, probably the bottom of the barrel in terms of those positions in the NACL. I would argue that LJX has been the worst AD carry, that Aspect has been the worst mid laner in the NACL, and that's okay. Obviously, both of these players have upside. Aspect has certainly had games where he's looked pretty good. LJX was just kind of thrown into this team with not a lot of time to practice with them. So I can see a world in which, obviously, both of them get better as they get more time playing together, but as it is right now, neither of them are really playing all that well, and it's definitely a problem for TLF. They're not the only ones. Rovex has really struggled to adapt to this level. I still think Surdy is okay, and City Witty certainly had some moments in the series, but he also died a metric ton and was definitely out-jungled by Tomio. So overall, Cloud9 was just the better team by a lot. There's really not a lot of analysis I can do. TLF, while maybe not being the worst team in the league, shout out CLGF and FlyFam, is certainly not going to be a team that is competing with some of the other teams in the region. They are bottom three. The bottom three has felt solidified for quite a long time, and TLF is definitely a part of that, especially now with some of the roster changes. So a little bit of a bad performance here for them, but for Cloud9, it's exactly what should have happened. You absolutely destroyed them, and you proved why you are in the upper echelons of the standings and the upper echelons of the power rankings. Hopefully you can keep it up. I know Diplex has come in and kind of been a seamless replacement. It's going to be more interesting when they start playing teams that are going to press them in the mid lane just a tad bit more early on in games. I still think Diplex is going to be able to hold up, but that is something to at least consider. At least in this series, though, it didn't really matter because C9 really was that much better. And then we move on to our final series of day number 1 here, and it's another blowout, another good team playing a team that has really struggled so far this year. We had Golden Guardians Challengers take it on FlyFam, and Golden Guardians does get the job done here. They have really started to step it up in recent weeks. This team started off just drawing every single series 1-1, basically no matter who they were playing against, but they've won a lot recently, and a lot of that uptick, in my opinion, has been due to the re-emergence of this bot lane being incredibly good. Array and Prismal have really stepped it up in the recent weeks, and this series is no exception. Array is going to get another player of the series for me. He is right up there in the player of the series standings. He's tied for second amongst all players in the NACL in my player of the series rankings, and that just really shows how much this team has started to rely on him as the second half has gone on. I would say a player like Young has definitely been the most consistent for Golden Guardians over the course of the entire year, but when Array and Prismal win, they really win, and they really won in this series. Shout out to Instinct and Sword. They could not keep up with Array and Prismal. Array just continues to look really good on these late game hyper carries. These are the kinds of champions that I think he really prefers. 2 games of Zeri coming out here, and it definitely ends up working out for him. Obviously, being able to be enabled by either an Enchanter or an Engager as a Zeri pick is super flexible, not something that I would say is necessarily going to work against some of the best bot lanes in the world or anything like that, but Array just plays these laning phases so calm, so collected. He's able to generate small leads by getting in these nice skirmishes, and his positioning in late game teamfights has been phenomenal, and that was really shown off in this series. Big credit to Prismal, obviously played both sides of the coin here, played the Enchanter with Lulu in game 1, played the Engager with the Nautilus in game 2, both looking really good. I would say the Lulu game was definitely a little bit more impressive just because of how much he was getting out on the map, how much he was helping the rest of the team, but still just a good performance overall from a support that I think a lot of people went into the year hoping he was going to be the #1 support in the region or in the NACL. He's definitely not, I don't know, lived up to that, if only because some others have been really good, but he's not been bad by any stretch, and honestly, Array and Prismal have really stepped it up in recent weeks. Still want to point out Young. Young is still really good in the mid lane here. He gets to pull out the Zoe, gets to pull out the Sylas, is really consistent at being able to win lane and generate leads there, but is really smart at being able to take these mid-game skirmishes and being able to push the tempo forward for Golden Guardians. Those 3 players are the ones that are really driving home GG's success over the last few weeks. I've talked about how Concept and Rosethorn on the top side just have to not be problems because the bottom 3 on this team are really good, and that's kind of what it's been. That's really the kind of success story that they've gone to, is Concept being weak side, Rosethorn being more of a supportive jungler that's going to try and enable the rest of the team, and then allowing your carries to be able to win you the games. And that's what happened here for Golden Guardians. That's what's going to continue happening for Golden Guardians, and it's just a really good look overall for them. As for FlyFam, They're just not very good. They're right down there in the bottom 3 with a lot of the rest of the teams. They still have one of the weaker top sides on the map, even with the jungle change, in my opinion, although I do think it has been positive. Where Hyper wasn't particularly good in this series, I still think that he showed a little bit more than what Maniac was able to show and what Goo was able to show earlier on in the year. I like bringing in Hyper. I think he gives you a little bit more now than some of these other players, but Lunacia is going to get my dud of the series again. He's gotten quite a few of these this year. That Jax game 2 was miserable coming out from him. Going into a player like Concept, who, yes, has done a very good job of limiting a lot of the mistakes that he was making last year and earlier on this year. I still don't think he's like a top-tier top laner in the region or anything like that, and so to go into that and just have such a miserable game 2 on that Jax is just not a very good experience. A champion that is really strong right now. Lunacia's really got to step it up. He just has not been particularly good in that top side, but like I said, Hyper was also not great. An early game jungler like Elise in game 1 where he wasn't able to win early game. A more supportive, enabling jungler like the Sejuani in game 2 where his team just kind of got outclassed. Really not a lot of impact coming out from the top side of FlyFam, and that's going to be a problem anytime you're facing a team like Golden Guardians where you really need to kind of exploit that top side because the bot side of the map is going to be incredibly strong like they were in this series, and if you're not able to win up on that side, if your players aren't playing super well there, then you're probably not going to have a very easy time winning that series, and that's what happened here for FlyFam. I think overall, they're definitely who we think they are, a bottom 3 team. I still think they maybe have a little bit more upside than they did like 2 or 3 weeks ago. They are showing at least a little bit of fight in some of these games, but at the end of the day, not a team that's going to particularly dominate anybody in the league, and definitely a candidate for relegation as we head closer to playoffs, but for Golden Guardians, they're streaking at the right time. It is always better to get stronger as the season goes on than it is to start strong. And that is the case for Golden Guardians. It feels like this team has gotten better week after week. Specifically this bot lane, like I said, if they can keep this up, like they could genuinely be one of the better teams in the NACL and one of the stronger teams come playoff time. But they are going to have to prove it against some better competition than a team like FlyFam. I like the carry threats of these players. Hopefully the top side can stay as stable as they have been. If that continues, this team is genuinely going to be very scary to play as we head further into playoffs. Now we've wrapped up our first day of NACL action here in Week 6. It's time to move on to day number 2. And day 2 was definitely a little bit more competitive, in my opinion, than day 1. We had a couple blowouts on day 1, not nearly as many blowouts here in day 2. And that kicks off, unfortunately, with a blowout in our first series, which is FlyQuest Challengers taking on 100 Thieves Challengers. It was a blowout, but not in the direction that we all thought it would be, as FlyQuest Challengers really show up and really play well in this one to earn the 2-0 win, and they're just by far the better team. There really is no other way to put it in this one. Their bot lane in particular played phenomenal, obviously finally getting everybody in. This FlyQuest organization is Ayla coming in for the main roster. That means Winsome is now playing for the Challengers team. That's an upgrade to Kitong in the support position. And then Masu finally getting his visa. He doesn't have to play on 6,000 ping anymore. He can actually play from Los Angeles, from the place where the server is. And he proved that that was a pretty big upgrade in this series, as he's going to get my player of the series for FlyQuest. He's already been one of the better AD carries in the entire NACL up until this point in the year, but now that he's actually on ping and, like, not having to play with such ridiculous lag, he might be the best. Like, there's a real argument to be made that Masu is playing better than almost any other AD carry in the NACL, and for him to go up against, in my opinion, the best bot lane in the NACL in 100 Thieves, Unforgiven, and Destiny, and to just be better in the series in both games, in the 2v2, in the mid-game skirmishes, positioning-wise, it's really impressive stuff, and if this is the Masu we're going to get, like, he is very quickly going to make his way to the LCS if this is the case. He certainly wasn't the only person to play well on the side of FlyQuest. Winsome did a really good job enabling him. 2 games of Nautilus. You're not seeing a lot of Engagers right now. Obviously, Enchanters still strong, but I would say Engagers are coming back just a tad bit. Nautilus, of course, chief among them. Winsome playing his first games here in Academy after playing the whole year in LCS so far. I thought he looked good. I thought he was pretty solid. He is a good support. He's probably one of the best supports at this level, and it's going to be really interesting to see how these two get along in the bot lane as the season, you know, as playoffs kind of roll around now. And then the other player I want to shout out on FlyQuest is Philip in the top lane. He actually started off the season rather slow. I was talking about him and Yuji as being relatively underwhelming to start the year, because both realistically should probably be some of the best players in their position in the NACL. Neither were really performing like it, but Philip in particular has really stepped it up in recent weeks. He was just better than Sniper in this series, and it wasn't particularly close, so big credit to the top side, big credit to the bot side. The side lanes really are taking over here for FlyQuest. Not to say the rest of the team didn't play well, but it really was the side lanes that were capturing a lot of the attention. As for 100 Thieves on the other side, this is a frustrating loss. It's only your second, 0-2 loss of the season, which isn't particularly good, but this is a team that hasn't looked nearly as consistent as I think a lot of us wanted them to. Obviously, we were looking at them as the best bot lane in the league, and I think up until this point, they definitely have performed as such. Unforgiven and Destiny have both been, big proponents of this 100 Thieves team being near the top of the standings pretty much all of the series they win. I'm not going to say because of the bot lane, but they were player of the series and in most of them, I would say, but they kind of got outplayed in this one. Destiny in particular, Lulu, Braum, it didn't really matter. Just didn't really have a lot of pressure in this game, and you're kind of hoping for more as we move on. And then, of course, my dud of the series is going to go to Sniper in the top lane. Just not really impactful at all. 0-5-1 is not a very good scoreline. He was pretty bad on the Jax in game 1. Definitely got run over by the Gangplank in that one. And then game 2, he goes to the Olaf, something that really does need to generate gold in order to be useful. I think Olaf is strong, but he's playing into Sion, and Sion's just going to outscale him in that position. So overall, I just really like how FlyQuest played this series. 100 Thieves got outplayed in the top lane, in the bot lane, and those are the places where they've generally been able to generate most of their leads this season. So big credit to FlyQuest, an absolutely huge win for a team that I think has been just kind of meh overall in 2023. They did not look meh in this series. 100 Thieves is a good team, and FlyQuest was just kind of clearly better than them across both of these games. And then moving on to our second series of day number 2 here, it's kind of an interesting one that I thought was going to be a little bit more dominant than maybe some of the other ones we've seen, but it's actually a 1-1 split. We had Immortals challengers taking on FlyFam, and they do split 1-1. Impressive stuff. FlyFam actually wins a game. This is their first win against a team that is not CLG Faith, which is, a pretty insane thing to say, but both of those teams have just been the bottom of the barrel when it comes to NACL so far this year. Not because they have bad players, but just because it does not seem like they're able to get on the same page. But they finally are able to take a game, this time over Immortals Challengers, a team that really felt like it was finally starting to find its stride after a rather boring start to the year. Again, another team that I think really loves 1-1 series, and it's another one that they have here. 7 of their 12 series this year have been 1-1 draws, and that's just insane, right? Like, statistically speaking, that's pretty insane, but that's just who Immortals are, and we saw a lot of that in this series. Game 1 was relatively okay from Immortals off the back of the bot lane looking relatively good. Wixie in particular actually looking pretty solid in this series. A good Game 1 coming out from him, but really, I would say Game 2 was the more impressive win from these teams, and it was FlyFam picking up the win. Of course, only their second win of the year, but still a strong one, and it's finally time for me to talk about this bot lane of FlyFam, who I thought were going to be, the part of the team that kept them afloat as we went throughout the year. Instinct, someone who played in the LCS last year. Sword, someone who's had plenty of time to play at the Academy, NACL second tier level here. Neither of them have really been all that good in 2023. Neither of them have been in positions where they're consistently winning 2v2s, where they're helping to win the games, but at least in this one, they were able to help win that game number 2. Sword in particular, who's going to get my player of the series here, he was really, really good. A couple of really solid games coming out from him. I've just, again, been a little bit underwhelmed by what this bot lane has been able to put out, so it's really good to finally see them have a genuinely good game against a bot lane that, at times has looked good. I like Joey as a player, especially in the support position, and so to see Sword and Instinct step up and honestly just look better as the bot lane in this series is a good thing. That's not to take away from the Immortals bot lane. That was probably the best part of Immortals in this series, but Sword and Instinct in particular I thought looked relatively strong in this one. The other player that I want to point out, I guess, on the side of FlyFam, Lunacia. I know I've been very low on Lunacia. Yes, I do understand he's like top 3 or top 5 or something like that in solo kills in the NACL right now, but I think he's got some major problems outside of the flash plays. I think once you watch an entire game of Lunacia, he makes quite a few errors. He's constantly down in gold. That kind of stuff that I think you would need to clean up in order to be like a relatively, top tier top laner. But he absolutely has talent, and he certainly has dueling talent. And he showed that in this series. He's not going up against one of the best top laners in the region or anything like that in ADD, but still, Lunacia coming out and honestly just being the better top laner in this series is a really good sign. It's something that I don't think he's really shown at any point in 2023, so to see it in this series, I really do think is a positive. So Sword, Instinct, Lunacia, definitely the bright spots of FlyFam for me, but on the side of Immortals Challengers, it's not all doom and gloom. Like I said, Wixie and Joey, I think, had a relatively good series. Wixie, in particular, I thought was pretty solid. I've been pretty low on Wixie in 2023 and what he's been able to offer. I think Joey is a pretty solid, very stable support there for Immortals, but Wixie at times has just been caught with some bad positioning, overstepping in a lot of these team fights. He's still very young, still kind of inexperienced, obviously had some time on 100 Thieves last year, but for the most part is still growing into this role. I think this series was pretty good considering he was going into a bot lane that was also performing a really, really good game one from the bot lane. They just weren't able to translate it into anything else. I will also say this, usually for Immortals, when they're able to take a lot of these games, it's off the back of their mid laner, and unfortunately, this series wasn't really the case for that. Balulu's actually going to be getting my dud of the series here. You know, I didn't really mention FlyFam's Blaze as like a big, you know, proponent factor in their wins, but he had a very good game too. It just wasn't a very good game one from him. And I actually think Balulu kind of got outplayed in that game pretty significantly. Very disappointing because Balulu, I think, generally speaking, has been really, really good for this Immortals Challengers team over the year. Definitely this team's best player, but it really was the solo laners, in my opinion, that held this team back in this series and caused them to lose that game too. Balulu, we kind of talked about, but also ADD in that same vein. Those two solo laners were definitely kind of the two members that I think performed the worst on Immortals, especially in that game 2 loss. So overall, I would say Immortals probably wanted to win this series 2-0, and they probably expected to win the series 2-0. To drop a game here, I don't think was on their radar, and it's not necessarily what they wanted, but at the end of the day, at least you were able to win one. If you would have lost both, that would have been an absolute disaster. I still think that there are a lot of areas that this team needs to clean up. The top side of the map is still a weakness. I think ADD in particular has been one of the weaker top lanes in the NACL. I think Chad has, you know, yet to really break out and have that game-defining moment. I do think that there were good showings coming out from the bot lane here, but the consistency has always been a problem for this Immortals team, and that definitely seeped through in this series. As for FlyFam, congratulations, you got your second win of the year. That's got to feel pretty good. Hopefully you can kind of use this to bounce into something a little bit better, because you've been, quite frankly, just not very good up until this point this year. Hopefully the bot lane can continue to step up. They are the part of the map that I think has to win in order for this team to feel a lot more comfortable, but Lunacia with a really good series, if he can just keep the flash moments high and the mistakes low, I think that's going to be positive for them. I thought Blaze was a lot better. Hyper has definitely made this team look a lot better. I think they're finally starting to find a configuration that works for them, and I guess I'm just really hoping that it continues to at least be relatively competitive rather than, you know, the 0-1-10 team that they were going into this series. That's going to bring us to our third series of day 2 here, and it's a pretty good one. Two actively very top-level teams here in the standings, in terms of the power rankings, all that stuff. We had Team Liquid Challengers taking on Dignitas Challengers. Of course, Dignitas Challengers with a little bit of a roster swap. Tomo, you know, pretty famously getting called up to the LCS right now, getting to play there and actually playing relatively well. That means their LCS AD carry Spawn is now back down here in the NACL. He performed really well here last year. It's going to be interesting to see if he can do the same. It means Tomo and Diamond are separated. It's Spawn and Diamond in that Dignitas bot lane now, and to start it off, it's not perfect for Dignitas here. It's a 1-1 split. Not that TL is a bad team by any means. They are a competitive team. They are a solid team, but you would have liked to see Dignitas take both games here. Team Liquid actually probably looks like the better team here, I would say, although both games are relatively split per team. So game 1, very Team Liquid heavy. Game 2, pretty Dignitas heavy. My player of the series is gonna go to the player that was probably the most consistent across both games, however, and that is APA, who just continues to be an absolute monster for Team Liquid here in the mid lane. One of the best players in the NACL, regardless of position. I know a lot of people, me included, have been super high on APA for a super long time. It's really good to see him get his shot here on a genuinely good team with genuinely good teammates and be able to make it work. He has been the best player on Team Liquid Challengers, and he's quite frankly been a borderline LCS caliber mid laner all year long already. He was awesome in game number 1, easily player of the game in that win, but he was also the driving force in the game that kind of kept them in that game for as long as they were in it. It still was pretty Dignitas favored, but APA was definitely the member of the team that I think was hanging on the most when it came to game number 2. So very deserving of that player of the game. The other player on Team Liquid that I want to shout out, Kimdown in the support position. I know Arrow's going to get a lot of the credit for how good the bot lane has been because of the veteran presence. You know, former LCS MVP Arrow and, you know, LCK player Arrow, but Kim Down's actually been pretty solid, I would say, over the course of the year, and in my opinion, I think Kim Down's probably been the better member of that bot lane in 2023, which is a big task. It's not like Arrow has been garbage. I think Arrow has had some really solid games, but Kim Down, especially recently, has been particularly good in the early 2v2, and at being able to get out on the map and play with Mir and play for the macro game. I think he's really helped out Team Liquid a lot. They're on a, relatively speaking, hot streak right now. They're kind of building their confidence back from being kind of this mediocre team at the beginning of the year to genuinely trying to compete for that top, 5, top 6 spot in the power rankings, and I think Kim Down is, his emergence has been a big reason for that. So APA being the big star here and Kim Down playing well, I think were the two big standouts for Team Liquid. As for Dignitas on the other side, they had some good players of their own. I actually think Spawn had a really good opening series here for Dig. I know some people are going to look at Spawn and, see an unredeemable player because he had a couple of really bad games and he really lost his mind, like momentum, his mental. You could tell he was entirely tilted on that Dignitas team and just couldn't win games. But he came in here in game number 2, won his first game of the year. First of all, congratulations. But he was probably the player of that game in game 2. He was really solid. I talked about this last year when it came to Spawn. He was one of my MVP candidates in the NA Academy League before he got called up to Dignitas last year. And I think he absolutely deserved to be mentioned in that category. He was really, really good down here with JJ. And I think he could be good again. I think he just needs to rebuild his mental, rebuild his confidence. He's always had really good mechanics. It's all just about getting it back mentally. So hopefully he can get that a little bit from this series. But we do have to talk a bit about my dud of the series, with APA being my player of the series. His counterpart on Dignitas is going to get the dud of the series here, and that's Insanity. He's gotten quite a few of these. I think 4 so far this year in the NACL. Insanity's not really having the year that I think a lot of people expected him to have. I think me and a lot of other analysts had Insanity as the #1 mid laner in the NACL heading into 2023. It just really has not played out like that. In my opinion, he's probably been the least consistent member of this Dignitas team that really has played well, but in their losses, it's usually Insanity overextending, getting picked on by the enemy jungler, and the rest of the team just not being able to kind of make up for that. And that was kind of the case here in game number 1. I still think Insanity can be a pretty solid player. We've seen him be good, not only at this level before, but at the LCS level for Immortals before. So we know Insanity is a really solid player, but it really hasn't been the best of years, I would say, so far for him. And I really don't think this series was a great showing for him overall. But both of these teams I do think are relatively solid. I think Team Liquid's going to be incredibly happy with the 1-1 draw here over a team like Dignitas, who has pretty consistently been top 2 in the standings over the past year or so. So really good win for them. Dignitas, though, definitely needs to work some things out. I'm not going to say this is a bad series overall for them, but Spawn coming in, I'm going to give them a little bit of time to get used to the new roster, but this should be a team that competes for top 1 in the league. And if they're not doing that consistently, if they're not winning 2-0 series against teams that they should be beating, that's when it starts to get a little bit concerning about what Dignitas is actually going to be able to do. So not going to hit the panic button at all yet. A 1-1 here against Team Liquid is certainly not bad. Being able to pick up a win is still pretty solid, but there is a world in which I can imagine a future scenario where they just kind of fall off and become a mediocre team. Hopefully that's not the case, but the series didn't exactly give me the most confidence that that isn't going to happen. And then moving on to our 4th series of day 2 here. It's kind of an interesting one. 2 teams that have really yet to find their footing, I think, to say it nicely, as we've gotten into week 6 here. We had AoE Gold taking on CLG Faith, 2 amateur provisional teams with LCS backers here. AoE obviously with Golden Guardians. CLG Faith, I think you can guess who they're with. But AoE Gold is able to take the 2-0 series win. CLG continues to really struggle. They're just not super good right now. Not to be rude, they just haven't really figured out how to win a lot of games yet. Even AoE has figured out to win quite a few. This is a team that has actually drawn a lot of series that they played this year, despite the fact that I don't think they've ever really been viewed as, like, top-tier competition. I do think they have a lot of talented players on their team. I talked about them earlier in the week, but they came through again in this one, most specifically the player of the series, Darkwings, who was, again, really, really good here. I think that mid lane position is a really big deal for AoE Gold. It's someone who they're really going to need to step up and play at a relatively decent level, and Darkwings did that in this game, and honestly, really impressive to see him do that in 2 straight series. That's been the biggest problem for AoE Gold, is they'll have moments where they look really good, and then the next series they'll come out and they won't be the same players. They just won't be playing at that same level. It's a little bit disappointing, but it's really good to see, Darkwings really be, I would say, the best player in their series both games this week. I think that is something that we've kind of been waiting for from him. I've been a big fan of him, but I think we've all been waiting for that from him, and he did that in this series. Very much deserving a player of the series. The other player on AoE that I want to give a big shout out to, Gamsu in the top lane. He's had some bad moments this year. We have to be entirely honest with ourselves. The consistency coming out of that top side has not necessarily been where I think this team wanted it to be. However, Gamsu is still a pretty good top laner when he's able to generate his leads, and he was a lot better than Bajani in this series, who has just not been particularly good. In my opinion, for my money, Bajani's probably been the weakest top laner in the NACL, and I think Gamsu did take a little bit of advantage of that. I think when these solo laners can rock and roll, when they can get leads, when they can push into the mid game, I think this AoE team is actually pretty strong. It's just the consistency with which those two players have been able to generate those leads. I like Winnie, I like Lynx, Skytech's been alright. I just don't think that without Dark Wings and Gamsu, this team is really ever going to be a contender for the top spots in the league. Those two really need to step up and be the carries. Luckily for them, they were in this series. As for CLG Faith on the other side, I already talked about it a bit, but Bajani in the top lane is going to be my dud of the series. He just continues to not have a particularly good year. His former teammate, Saranok, already got replaced. Those two kind of came in as the big solo lane duo. They had played together for quite a few years before that, and neither of them really took to the NACL all that well. Saranok is out. Bajani might be getting close to that, trigger pull. Just CLG Faith is desperately trying to find something that is going to change their season around. Aaron came in to play bot lane with Sketch, moving back to support. You had Town come in to play mid lane. None of this really seems to be working. This team just continues to have major problems playing against even some of the more questionable and inconsistent teams in the league like AoE, and I think topside is a big reason for that. Bajani wasn't particularly good in the series, but neither was NXI in the jungle, who I think has really been disappointing in 2023. Remember, this was a player that at one point in time was looked at as one of the best jungle prospects in North America. He had that year on 100 Thieves where he looked phenomenal on 100 Next, then he got drafted over to FlyQuest, in Scouting Grounds, got to play for their academy team for a bit, got even to play in the LCS for a bit, and ever since then, it's not really been there for NXI, and it's a little bit disappointing, but he was also not very good in this series. Winnie definitely out-jungled him between these two teams, and that's just not a very good sign, right? CLGF just feels like they lack this level of, I don't want to say drive, because obviously these players are trying to win, but when you watch these games, it feels like either they don't know how to make plays or they don't know where to make the plays. I will say for CLG Faith, the bot lane looked okay in this series. Aaron and Sketch, I thought definitely took a step up from some of the series that they had played before. Aaron in particular, I think, has definitely shown to be a nice inclusion here. I don't think Plux was playing all that well before Aaron came back and Sketch got officially moved down to support, so it's good to see this bot lane kind of start to formulate at least a little bit of a way to win early on in games. Unfortunately, it's just going to take a lot more than that for this team to generally win a lot of games. Town had one good game here in game number 1, but he got completely outplayed in game 2. Obviously, they couldn't hang on to game number 1, and so you're just looking at a season where CLG Faith is now sitting at 0-1-11. They've only won one game the entire split, and it's against the other worst team in the league in FlyFam. They couldn't even win that 2-0, so definitely starting to get concerned. CLG Faith, after FlyFam showing earlier in the week, definitely might be considered the worst team in the league at this point, and I really don't think it's all that up for discussion anymore. As for AoE, it's a good win, not exactly against the best team in the entire world, but, to see that these two solo laners can come out and have two really good series back-to-back, I think is a really good sign for them. Hopefully they're able to keep it up. When Dark Wings and Gamsu play well, this team does pose a threat to some of those teams in the top 6, top 7 of the power rankings. This isn't enough for me to raise them from, number 13 or 12 or somewhere around there in my power rankings, but, this is a team that I do think has upside, and I do like some of these players, and at least they're showing improvement and growth, and I think really at the end of the day, that's what the NACL is all about. But then moving into our final bracket of games here, our 5th series of day number 2, we kicked off our final little group of games with the series between Golden Guardians Challengers and Evil Geniuses Challengers. And it's a 2-0 for Golden Guardians. Not only is the LCS team really outperforming a lot of expectations right now, but the NACL team is really starting to catch their stride. They've been fantastic in recent weeks, and a lot of it is due to the breakout of this bot lane. We talked about how Array had really stepped it up in recent weeks. Well, for me, my player of the series here for Golden Guardians is going to go to Prismal in the support position. I think Prismal has honestly gotten a little bit overlooked when it comes to how good this Golden Guardians team has been. As good as Young and Array are, and they definitely deserve a lot of the credit, Prismal definitely deserves to be in that conversation as well, and he was fantastic in this series, and he's been really good early on in lane. He's been great in the 2v2. That's what's really impressed me the most, is his ability to consistently pressure out opposing AD carries in the early 2v2 to generate leads, no matter the lane that they're playing. He can play it on Enchanters, he can play it on Engagers. He just does a really good job of knowing when he can pressure early and playing around timings and all that good stuff. He's just really smart. He's good at roaming as well, don't get me wrong, but I do think his synergy with Array and the bot lane has really stepped up the game of what Golden Guardians has been able to do, because they do like playing for bot lane now, and that's definitely clear, and that was definitely clear in this series. Prismal player of the series, you gotta shout out Array as well. Prismal was really good, but he had to enable somebody, and he definitely enabled Array in this series. I think that there are a lot of players that you could give a big shout out to on the side of Golden Guardians. Array was probably the big damage dealer, but Young had a phenomenal series. He was everywhere on the map that he needed to be. He dominated the mid lane matchup into Ryoma, especially in that game number 2. And Ryoma's actually had some really good laning phases ever since he came over to the NACL here, so definitely still impressed with what Young and Array have been able to do. Those two are very quickly making a case to be LCS ready. I know Young didn't exactly look perfect in his small time in the LCS, but obviously didn't have a ton of time to train with the team or anything like that. I think with more time, like, he is clearly proving that he is an LCS level prospect. Array is in a similar boat. We've known Prismo's been there for a long time. I think the one player that I haven't really talked about on this team that actually had a really good series is Rosethorn. I haven't really mentioned the jungle position a lot for Golden Guardians this year, mostly because, like I said in some previous entries, the Golden Guardians top side has kind of been the passive side of the team. Concept has been weak side. Rosethorn has taken more of a supportive role. It really has been about the carry roles for Golden Guardians so far this year, and that's definitely applied to jungle, who's taken a little bit more of a backseat role, but Rosethorn, I thought, actually had a phenomenal series, completely out-jungled Shaden. Shaden ran into some trouble early from just some over-aggressive plays that didn't end up working out, and Rosethorn did a phenomenal job of being able to squeeze the rest of the series out of the game for Golden Guardians. So big shout out to those 4 players. I think all of them played well on the side of GG. It wasn't perfect for EG, though, who ended up losing the series 0-2. This team just can't seem to find its stride, and most of it is just because of the inconsistency of some of its top players. We've been talking about how jungle mid, it was a strength for them before this week. Well, not this week it wasn't, because another dud of the series here for Shaden in the jungle. He goes 1-11 in this series. Not very good for a jungler that at one point in time was looked at as the biggest jungle prospect in North America. Even just this year, I mean, go back to week 2, and this guy was looking completely and utterly unstoppable for EGC, even with some less than satisfactory laners here with Robbie Bob, with mobility, and players who didn't have a lot of time to scrim with the team, who aren't necessarily, you know, these big dominant NACL players. Shaden just has kind of fallen off of a cliff now, and it's not just him. Obviously, he had a pretty bad series here, but Ryoma was also not very good in this series, especially in that game number 2. You really want to see more out of those 2 players. Those 2 are the carries of Evil Geniuses. Make no mistake about it. When they have bad games, they're not going to win. When they have good games, they're probably going to win. Unfortunately, here against Golden Guardians, against a good team, they had some bad games, and they did not win. Definitely disappointing coming out from Evil Geniuses. A team that one week looks really good and another looks bad. I do want to give a nice shout out, though. Evil Geniuses bot lane, I think, is doing better than I think people give them credit for. I still think Smoothie has certainly had some bad moments, and he has certainly not been perfect. But Mobility, you know, big honors to Mobility. This is somebody who I think was never expecting to be in this position for a team that wanted to compete for the upper echelons of the NACL, but he was kind of thrust into there with King not being able to make it. And he has honestly filled in incredibly valiantly. He's been anything but the problem for Evil Geniuses so far in 2023, and that's just a huge positive, I would say, for the team overall. He was definitely the shining light for Evil Geniuses in this series, and I think with some better teammates around him, honestly, there was a real chance he could have won this series for the team. Unfortunately, jungle mid did kind of run it, so not a lot of options there. I would say overall for Evil Geniuses, they just continuously proved to me that they don't deserve to belong anywhere near top 6, top 7. I mean, this is a borderline top 10 team in the NACL right now, and that's just the truth of it. They're not very good, and they're certainly not consistent. If Shaden and Ryoma can have good games, this team can probably beat almost anybody in the league, but when they don't, they're just not going to be able to win a lot, and that is especially true against a good team like Golden Guardians, and make no mistake, they are good. They have proven at this point now that their big trio of Young, Array, and Prismal are just as good as almost anybody in the entire league. They are very quickly jumping up the standings. I think they're in 3rd place after this win. Absolutely huge from them. If they can get more contributions out of Rosethorn like they got in this series, this could genuinely be a team to watch out for to take the title here in spring, and I, for one, am really, really excited to watch this. This Golden Guardians organization has surprised us all this year, and this is kind of just an extension of that. And then moving on to our final series of day number 2 here, and it's a classic rivalry, but according to the LCS, the rivalry's dead now. We had TSM Challengers taking on CLG Challengers. Of course, it's always good to see these two orgs facing off, especially when you got some classic TSM players who very much did live through the TSM-CLG rivalry in this game, but it is CLG coming out on top, and it's not really to anybody's surprise. They should have been the team that ended up winning this game, and they were. They won it 2-0, and they looked pretty good doing it, most specifically this bot lane, which at times this season has looked unstoppable. At other times has looked a little bit stoppable, but when they play well, like, they really win. There is just not an AD carry in the league that is more mechanically talented than Meech. I'm willing to go out and say it. Watching Meech play when he's like on his A game, when he's not making mistakes, when he's not overstepping, he is like phenomenal. He is already LCS level, but it's just the consistency that's always been a problem for him coming down in the bot lane. But talk about a series where he looked great. Another really good one for him. He's going to get player of the series here for CLG. Meech, like I said, when he's on, man, he rocks. And him and Breezy have really good synergy down in the bot lane. They've obviously grown that over the past year or so, but both of them, I think, are having really good seasons for CLG challengers. Breezy, I think I've talked about quite a bit on this channel, obviously, as an ASU fan. Forks up. Always got to cheer my boy Breezy, but for Meech and Breezy, just in general, like, it's really good to watch them actually play at a high level, at this level. I think Wild Turtle and Dragku have at times been the driving force of TSM challengers, and it's good to see them, you know, really be able to look at Wild Turtle, who had a good game in game 2, we'll get to that, and just say, you know what, we're better. It doesn't matter. Even if you're having a good game, we're just going to play better, and I think that's what happened with the bot lane there. The other player that I really got to shout out on the side of CLG, Kevy, their jungler, who I think has honestly been underrated so far in 2023, has had some really, really good games. I think Kevy in general is almost overlooked on this team because Copy is playing so well, because Meech is so talented, because Breezy creates so many plays, especially on some of his famous engagers. I feel like Kevy almost gets lost in the shuffle sometimes. A player like Jenkins has even been in the LCS, right? But I think Kevy is probably the most consistent member of this team, maybe outside of Copy, because he just always shows up. I can't remember a performance where Kevy was just completely destroyed by anybody in the league this year, and that is a testament. Like, that is a talent to have, and I think it really came out. I think most of the time this team has really been carried by its mid lane spot, but in this series it was jungle and it was bot lane that I think really stepped up and drove CLG to the win. As for TSM on the other side, the O2 loss isn't particularly what you wanted to see, but it's not particularly surprising either. I think it's pretty clear at this point that this is the weakest challengers team in the NACL, the weakest non-provisional team in the NACL, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that they just don't have a very good jungle mid duo, and I hate to say it, but it just kind of is the case. Svenskeren is going to get dud of the series again here. That's his 3rd or his 4th of the year so far. He's been a huge negative, genuinely one of the worst junglers in the NACL, in my opinion. Doesn't even really go for a lot of these plays, ends up playing really safe in the early game, and then just doesn't really make plays in the mid game. And that's kind of what I want to talk about with TSM as a whole, where it's just a team that really fails to capitalize on any sort of macro advantage they're able to generate at all in the game. Sometimes their bot lane does win. Sometimes their mid lane does win. Top lane actually wins relatively frequently. The problem is that once they hit the mid game, they really don't know what to do with any of that gold, and they eventually get outscaled in basically every game that they're playing. Their team fighting is bad, their decision making is bad, and a lot of that for me falls on Svenskeren, who just seems to be super passive in the mid game. I'm not exactly sure if that's just his design, like if that's just how he wants to play the game, or, you know, if he's being coached that way, or if that's just how the other players on the team, they don't want to like overforce or whatever. But this team has shown a lack of aggressiveness, and I think it definitely came up in this series, especially in game number 2. But Sven's just not particularly good at that. Even when he is able to generate early leads, almost all of them are gone by the time we hit the end game, and that's just the sign of a jungler who doesn't know how to capitalize on his advantages. It's not all his fault. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like bad macro is one player's fault. It will never be that, but he in particular, I think, struggles the most with playing from an advantage. And I think the other player that you got to shout out on the side of TSM not playing particularly well is Doxa in the mid lane. He's had some really good games this split. I would be remiss to say otherwise, but those were weeks ago, and we've just been kind of waiting on an opportunity for him to play like that again, and it hasn't really come up. He's kind of been outclassed by everybody he's played against. Yes, he's going up against Copy in this series, who is one of the best mid laners in the NACL, but you just got to be serviceable. Like, you got to be able to generate any sort of gold in these games, and he's just not able to do it. I think if this jungle mid duo continues to be a problem for TSM, this team is going to continue to struggle to win games. Shout out to Wild Turtle and Dragku, though. I do think they were fine in the series. Wild Turtle, in particular, in game number 2, looked okay. It's just the game was so far out of reach at that point. He was trying his best to salvage it on the Xayah, but really only so much you can do. I would say overall, TSM, like I said, probably looks like the worst challenger team in the league. They're sitting somewhere around the 12, 13, 11 spot in the rankings. They're not a top 10 team in the NACL, and I think until, this mid-jungle duo improves and they figure out whatever is going on with their macro, that is probably just not going to change. They're not really going to be a threat in the playoffs, and I think there absolutely is a worst-case scenario in which this team is looking at being like a bottom 3 or 4 team by the time the season is up. As for CLG, good week for them. Honestly, they've looked all right so far. Obviously, mid, bot, they look really good when they look good. It's all about the consistency. Really like to see Kevy performing well in the jungle. I think that's a big positive for me, but this bot lane, man, when they are on, they are on. Meech in particular, when he is winning, he is winning. When Breezy gets his champions, it is dominant, and that's what you want to see from CLG. This is a team that I really do think can take games off of anybody in the league. It's just about the consistency with them. I know I say that a lot about NACL teams, but that's because a lot of NACL teams have a lot of really good talent on them. CLG is certainly no exception. A really good win from them here, and it's going to be interesting to see what they do down the line. All right, now that we've wrapped up day number 2, it's time to move on to our third and final day of week number 6, day number 3. And this is where really a lot of information, I think, started to be given to us as fans as to where a lot of these teams lie. A lot of really interesting matchups here on day 3 that I'm excited to talk about. And the first one definitely kicks that off for us, as we saw a matchup between 100 Thieves Challengers and Wildcard Gaming. Kind of a game that I thought was going to be pretty close. Obviously, Wildcard, kind of an enigma of a team. Moose Hater can really win or lose you a lot of games, but this jungle mid duo has been incredibly efficient over the course of the year. I think both Keel and Saligo have been incredibly good for Wildcard. The bot lane can be pretty hit or miss, and top lane can definitely be hit or miss, but jungle mid can get you pretty far. Unfortunately, in this series in particular, not a lot can be done because 100 Thieves was able to generate some early leads and just kind of take that one to the bank off the back of their fantastic bot lane. I saw some people criticizing Unforgiven earlier in the week for that series that they had on day number 2, I believe it was. And honestly, I just don't really understand it at this level, right? Like, he's had some games where he hasn't been perfect. Definitely some games where he hasn't been, like, the dominant force that maybe he should be. But in a majority of the games that they have played, 100 Thieves' bot lane has just been able to generate large leads that other bot lanes in the league are just not able to do at this level. So, I don't really know what the big, gripe is with how they have played, most specifically because I think that they play well against almost every level of competition, whether it's low or high. I think they tend to do a really good job at both, and this series is a good testament to that. Kind of playing a mid-tier bot lane, but a pretty good team, and they came out and they dominated. My player of the series is going to go to Destiny in the support position. As much as I love Unforgiven, I'm starting to be won over by Destiny as, like, the big carry of this bot lane. He has been super good in 2023. I know that a lot of people don't like to look at supports and really, like, be wowed, but, support's a position that you learn to really love when you watch as many games as I do. You learn to really pick out the differences when you watch, however many games per week that I end up watching. I'm sure somebody out there has done the math, and Destiny really impresses me. I mean, the way that he's able to control laning phase, the way that he pairs up with his jungler and Yukino to be able to make plays around the map, especially during the mid game. Obviously, credit to Unforgiven for being able to play without a support for a lot of the time, but Destiny does a good job playing these enchanters and playing for his bot lane, or playing engagers and playing for the roam. Both styles, I think, have really worked for him, and I think it's pretty clear at this point that he is the best support in the NACL, and I really don't think that that's that crazy of a take to have. He was awesome in this series. He's been awesome all year. Then, of course, Unforgiven. It's hard not to talk about him, and when you talk about 100 Thieves games, that he's just so talented. He's such a big piece of what they want to do there in terms of game planning that it's really difficult to not pinpoint him as a big reason why they're able to win games, because when he gets ahead, they're probably going to win some games. He's really good at team fighting. He's really good at being able to capitalize on some of the advantages that he's able to get. He still has some weaknesses early in laning phases. That was his problem on Mad Lions as well, but at the end of the day, especially at this level, these are problems that he can definitely deal with, and for the most part, really haven't been issues for him at all. The other player that I want to give a big shout out to 100 Thieves is actually Sniper. He wasn't so great earlier on in the week, and honestly, hasn't had, like, any ridiculous breakout performances other than the first couple weeks of the season. He's kind of just been, I don't want to say a secondary piece for this 100 Thieves team, but they certainly haven't wanted to play through top lane quite like they did earlier in the year. I actually thought this was a great performance from him. Going into a player like Moose Hater, who can be a little bit volatile, I thought he took care of him really well, made sure not to give him any of his signature picks, and then got to the point where he was just stronger in both games and honestly looked really, really good. I think big shout out to the top and the bot lanes for 100 Thieves. They were the stars here. As for Wildcard, on the other side, not exactly how you wanted this week to go. That is 2 0-2 losses this week, which is certainly not what you signed up for. Yes, it was to two pretty good teams in the Fear and 100 Thieves, but you would have liked to at least pick up one of these. Unfortunately, you just weren't able to do that, and a lot of it, I hate to say it, is on topside. Moose Hater's going to get done of the series again here, and he's had quite a few of these this year for me. Obviously, he's had some fantastic game-winning performances on some off-meta champions, but I'm really worried about the consistency that he brings to the table. It really does seem like when he loses, he loses really hard, and that can be a problem, even at, like, lower levels, which we're seeing here with the NACL. I think he's getting exposed a little bit for his inability to play weak side nearly as well as some of the other top laners in the region, and Sniper's not the player that you can really afford to make major mistakes against. He's going to be able to punish you for those, and I think that happened in this series. I still think Moose Hater is one of the most talented top laners in the entire region. It's all just about consistency when it comes to him and when it comes to a lot of players that play like him. The other player I want to shout out that wasn't exactly perfect in the series is Keel in the jungle. I like Keel a lot. I actually think he's been a huge positive for Wildcard over the course of of the season, but it wasn't a particularly good series, I would say, overall for him. Yukino definitely had the control advantage, I would say, overall here, and that's not really saying a whole lot, because Yukino's not exactly been the dominant member of 100 Thieves, although I don't want to say bad things about Yukino. He's been a mid-tier jungler, but I would have expected Keel to come out and at least show a little bit more fire in the series, but it felt like the top side of the rift just wasn't really here for Wildcard. And you're going to get some days like that, obviously, with the volatility and the craziness that Wildcard ends up bringing to the table, the wildcardness of how they play the game. Sometimes you're just going to have games and days where you just don't really show up, and unfortunately that seemed to be one of these for Wildcard. I still think that they're a solid team. They can really make a lot of noise in the playoffs, but they certainly don't have the most momentum right now, and I would really like to see them have a nice bounce back week next week as opposed to what they did here. And then for 100 Thieves, good win. I mean, this team is still pretty good. I know not a lot of people are considering them at the top of the standings anymore, but talent-wise, they have the ability to go toe-to-toe with basically anybody in the NACL, and I think they show that off in a lot of their series. This was a really good win for them. They haven't exactly been on the best streak as of recently, so to see this kind of dominant 2-0 win, I think is really solid. This bot lane is still really good. Obviously, I'd like to see mid lane step up a tad bit more, but top lane kind of got their stuff back together, their shit back together in this game, and I think that's a really good sign. Hopefully, 100 Thieves can take this win and translate that momentum into the rest of the season rather than what they've kind of been doing up until this point. Moving on to our second series, though, of day number 3, and it's one I was really excited to see. Probably the series I was most excited for in week number 6. It was Cloud9 Challenger taking on Cincinnati Fear, and it's a 1-1 split. Both teams really stepping up and looking good here. This is a huge win for the Fear. I don't really have any other way to say this. Cloud9 is the best team in the NACL as of right now. Even with them switching out their mid laner, this team is so consistent and it's so stacked in pretty much every position. To have the Fear come in and take a win off of them is huge, is absolutely huge for them. We were talking about how the schedule was really brutal towards the end of the season for them, but maybe not. Beating Wildcard 2-0, drawing C9 1-1, like, these are really huge results that are going to get them in prime position come playoff time. But let's go ahead and talk about the series, because Cloud9 still played really well, and they still won game number 1, and that is definitely worth pointing out here. My player of the series is going to go to Zazel in the support position. Another support picking up player of the game here. Quite a few of these in day number 3. Hope you guys don't get a little bit annoyed by that. I know comment sections in the past have gotten annoyed that I give it 2 supports too much, but here you are, Zazel getting it in this series, and he absolutely deserves it. He was fantastic in both of these games. Game 1 was great for him, Game 2 was great for him. He's just been hyper consistent for Cloud9 over the course of the split. He's not necessarily been the support that I think has stood out the most. I think players like Destiny have really stood out. Even a player like Trevor on the other side of this, I think, has really stood out with some great games. I don't think Zazel's necessarily had the big, standout moments that those players have had, but he's just been so ridiculously good in almost all of their performances. This bot lane has been very consistent, especially in recent weeks. We'll talk about Lost in a bit. He had some moments in game number 2 where he didn't quite look up to snuff, but for the most part, Zazel's just been really good in the 2v2s, out of lane. Really, anything that you ask him to do, he's going to be able to do. We know he's a high-level shot caller, very similar to some of the other supports that we've mentioned as the upper echelon here in the NACL, and he just plays his role incredibly well. He makes Cloud9 a better team in every game that he's in, and I think that was really proven. Great game 1, really solid game 2 from him as well that I think is going to get overlooked because the Fear were awesome in that game, but Zazel, in my opinion, definitely deserving of player of the series. The other players on C9 that I really want to talk about, Tomio in the jungle. He was awesome in this series. I think both junglers really stepped up and had some fantastic games, especially in their wins. Tomio in game 1 was really good. We'll talk about Perry once we get to game number 2 here, but Tomio was definitely a standout player, and I think he's been awesome this year as well. Very similar to Zazel, not necessarily the same standout moments that some of the other top junglers in the league have had, but the consistency that he offers and just the ability to win in almost any circumstance on almost any champion is super commendable. And those two are a huge reason why Cloud9 is in the spot that they are. We can talk about how Eminence was fantastic through the first couple of games and how Lost has kind of taken up the big carry role for them, how Fake Gods had a couple of really good games. But to me, the backbone of this team is that jungle support role is Tomio, it's Zazel, and they have really, really been good, and they were really good in this series. One player that I do want to point out on the side of Cloud9 that wasn't exactly perfect in this series was actually Lost. I actually thought he had a really good game number 1 here, but Game 2, he was caught out a lot more than expected. A really good job by the Fear to isolate and target him in a lot of these fights, and I think a really good job by the Fear to make sure that he wasn't as involved in a lot of these fights as he has been in some past series. Obviously, Lost has kind of taken over the big carry mantle, I would say, for Cloud9 ever since Eminus left. Diplex is still a really good player, and I thought he had a pretty decent series, but Lost was definitely the difference maker in their previous weeks, and I'm not sure if that was just really good scouting by the Fear, but they definitely identified that if they were able to take him down in a lot of these fights, that they would just be able to win. And that's what they did. They did a really good job being able to target him. Credit that a lot to Perry, to Faisal, Manui I thought had a really good game too as well. So, a couple of things really going right, but Lost was kind of the player that I think stood out the most on the side of Cloud9 for maybe not being super up to snuff in this game. But on the side of the Fear, huge game 2 win. I think you could give player of the game to quite a few people. I would like to give it to probably Manui, who is really, really good in the bot lane. I've been talking about it. I think Manui has gotten better and better and better every single game. More comfortable, I should say, at this level every single game, and I think that shows in a matchup like this going into players like Lost and Zeyzal, who have so much experience, not only here in the NACL, but at the LCS level, even at Worlds. For both of those players, they both played at the World Championships, and for Manui to come in and honestly just look like the better AD carry in this series, I think is a really good showing. I think Perry was awesome in this series. We talked about Tomio looking really good in Game 1. Not exactly a great Game 1 from Perry, but a phenomenal Game 2 coming out from him, and then Faisal in the top lane, especially in that Game 2, was incredibly dominant. Those three players, I think, were the big standouts for Fear. Unfortunately, I do have to give dud of the series to somebody on Fear, and that's going to go to Shochi. Anybody who follows the channel knows that I'm a big fan of Shochi and how he's been able to play so far this year, but unfortunately, Game 1 was not his best work. That Taliyah game, it just felt a little bit lackluster, at least in comparison to what some of the other teammates were doing, especially in the bounce back in Game number 2, and in my opinion, it was probably the least impactful game that either team had, or any player on either team had in this series, but again, it's not to say that Shochi was terrible. I actually thought he had some really good moments, not only in Game 2, but in Game 1 as well. It's just it was kind of hard to pick a dud of the series in this series where I felt like most of the players had really good moments. Lost had a really good Game 1. He was the other person that I think was in the running for me for dud of the series, but that Game 1 from Shochi, in my opinion, just was a little bit lower on the totem pole. I still think that obviously Fear and Shochi are really fantastic, and obviously I'm cheering for them, as I think most people who watch the NACL are, but definitely some things I think they could work on there. Just maybe being a little bit more aggressive in the mid game, especially if you're going to pick something like Taliyah. But overall, I think both teams played relatively well here. Cloud9 probably wanted to take both games, but it's not entirely shocking that the Fear were able to take this. They've been on such a ridiculous hot streak as of recent. They've been able to play at such a high level. Obviously, their earlier series against Wildcard was a great showing of what this team can do from ahead. We got to see them play a bit from neutral in this game, which I think is a good sign. But overall, I think both teams come out of this series looking relatively strong. C9 looks like the best team in the league, especially when they play their game, and the Fear show that they can go toe-to-toe with anybody in the league, even as a provisional team. I think all 10 players here are players to watch, and I think they absolutely proved that across both of these games. And then moving on to our second bracket of games here, starting with our third series of day number 3. We had CLG Challengers taking on Team Liquid first, and CLG picks up the 2-0 series win. Nice win for them. Kind of expected. TLF is not looking good right now. I would argue that right now they have looked the worst that they have all year long. This week 6 was certainly not a good showing from them. Most of that coming from one lane in particular, which we will obviously get to. But let's talk about CLG first, because they won the series and they went 2-0 here. Really, really like what Breezy has been able to do in the support position. Stop giving him Rakan. I feel like at a certain point, we've realized that this champion is his signature champion, that he's really good at it, and he's probably going to beat you if you give him that champion. And I think that, unfortunately, TLF had to learn that the hard way in game number 2 here. Breezy's going to get my player of the series. That's 3 supports in a row. The people who hate when I put supports as player of the series are really going to cry about it in the comment section this time, but I really like Breezy as a player. Obviously, I've talked about it before, but him and Meech have been incredibly solid, I would say, for most of the year. Meech has certainly been kind of the superstar of the two, but Breezy's had some really big pop-off moments, mostly on these really fast, engage-oriented champions, things like, obviously, the Rakan in that game number 2 here. But Breezy, I think, has just been incredibly solid. He's been really solid for a while now. He was really good for the CLG team last year. He continues to be really good for them this year. And I think he's almost underrated as one of the NACL's top supports in the region. Not necessarily number 1, like on par with Destiny or anything like that, but I mean, definitely top, 5 or 6. Like, he's certainly in that conversation, and he has been for quite a long time. It doesn't necessarily feel like he ever gets brought up in that conversation, but in my opinion, he absolutely deserves to do so. The other player on CLGC that I really want to point out here, it's the staple, it's the standout, it's Copy in the mid lane. He's been phenomenal this year. He continues to prove game after game after game that he's ready. He's better than the competition at this level, and let me tell you, he actually played against a mid laner who was really, really jazzed for this matchup, clearly, because Aspect came in, and we'll talk about it in the TLF section, but Aspect came in and had a really good series on some champions he's a lot more familiar with, but Copy still was a big standout for CLGC. He was making so many plays across the map. He was winning in lane. Honestly, just a really good performance from a mid laner that has proven time and time again that he is LCS level. He is LCS caliber, and if he does get a shot at that level, he's probably going to make it count. But CLGC, generally speaking, just looking solid. It's not the best competition, but a win is a win. On the side of TL first, though, the problems are really starting to arise. We can talk about the good first, which is Aspect having a good series. I've been very critical of Aspect over the course of the year so far. I just feel like over the course of the year, when you look at every series, he's probably been the mid laner that has impressed me the least across all the teams in the NACL. Now, that's not to say he's been awful. He's had some good games, and he definitely had some good games in this series, but he's probably been the mid laner that has impressed me the least. Thank God that kind of got thrown out in this series against CLGC, where I actually thought he played really, really well. He got to play the Annie, he got to play the Cassio, and these are champions that he's clearly much more comfortable on. He was laning more aggressively, he was actively looking to make plays. It very much felt like he was involved a lot more than he had been in earlier series. He was very close to being done in the series earlier in the week, but unfortunately their bot lane was just a little bit worse, and again, that continues to be a problem for TLF, as LJX is going to get another dud of the series here. I feel bad giving him so many duds of the series as he jumps into playing here for TLF. But it really has not been a quick introduction for him on this team. Him and Rovex don't seem to have any chemistry in the 2v2. He doesn't really seem to have any ability to lane against some good bot laners, people like Meech, who just kind of took advantage of him, and Breezy, who took advantage of him in the 2v2 here. His team fighting ability doesn't really seem to be on the same level. He just has not had a very good introduction to the NACL. I feel bad for him. He hasn't really played competitively in like 2.5 years. He gets thrust into a spot on a team that's already struggling and is expected to basically take up the mantle and try and carry them out of the negative pit that they've already dug themselves into, and he's just not able to do that. It's not only his fault. I don't think Rovex has been particularly good at this level either. I was actually kind of hyped for Rovex going into the year. I had some hype on Rovex going in. I liked the tape that I saw, but basically none of that has translated, in my opinion, to TLF and to the NACL, so this bot lane just continues to be a weakness, and in my opinion, is probably the weakest in the entire league, and that's a problem. You know, you're not the weakest team in the league. CLGF certainly has kind of staked their claim, but if you want to talk about the strong point of CLGF, it's almost certainly their bot lane. TLF's their weak point is their bot lane. I would argue that LJX and Rovex have kind of claimed that bottom bot lane spot as of this point. Obviously, they all still have talent. I really do like these players. Rovex especially, I think, has shown moments of being really good at the amateur level. I think he could be good at the NACL level. It just doesn't seem to be working in 2023. But credit to Aspect, I actually thought he had a relatively good series. It just doesn't feel like TLF is going to be turning it around right now. Honestly, it feels like the opposite. It feels like TLF is honestly getting worse as the season goes on. It could be because they're playing better competition than they were a couple of weeks ago, but remember, this was the team that took a game off of their sister team, TL Challengers, just a couple of weeks ago, and it just doesn't feel like they're anywhere close to being at that level right now. So hopefully TLF can turn it around, because they could genuinely be a relegation candidate if things continue to go south for them. As for CLG Challengers, good series, not exactly the most dominant in the world against a team like TLF. Game 1 was relatively close. You would hope that they wouldn't be like that, but Copy continuing to be a star. I would say Meech and Breezy in the bot lane continuing to be really strong. They're the big standouts for CLG. I think Breezy in particular definitely earned player of the series here, and you're really just hoping that they can keep it up. Again, it's always going to be about consistency with this roster, but, you know, playing a team like this, it's a good step in showing that you do have that consistency if you were able to take the 2-0 here. But then moving on to our fourth series of the week, it was kind of an interesting one. Two teams that are kind of vying for upper tier eligibility. We had Team Liquid Challengers taking on FlyQuest Challengers, and FlyQuest picks up the 2-0 win. Kind of surprising here. If this went 2-0, I would have expected it to go the other way. But Team Liquid really hasn't looked all that perfect this year. They've dropped games that they really shouldn't be dropping, and they've done it to teams that they really shouldn't be losing to. Not to say that FlyQuest is a bad team. We'll get to why I'm really excited about FlyQuest, especially now with some of the roster changes, but Team Liquid, just the consistency really hasn't been there for them. Speaking on FlyQuest, though, we've hit it. We've hit the peak point for FlyQuest, because not only does their LCS team finally have their support in, but that means that the NACL team finally has their bot lane in, and man, does this look good for them. They're going to be skyrocketing up my power rankings this week because Winsome coming in has reinvigorated this team. Not only that, but Masu getting that visa, not having to play on 10,000 ping. I mean, that matters. Masu genuinely might be the best AD carry in the NACL, maybe behind Unforgiven, or maybe even with Unforgiven. Who knows? He's been playing out of his mind. He's going to get my player of the series here in the win over TL. A really good week for Masu. He came out and he beat two of the better bot lanes in the league, beating Unforgiven in that first series, beating Arrow in this series. Two very veteran presences that kind of are supposed to be super stable here in the NACL. Masu came in and beat both of them this week, and he looked really, really good doing it. If he's going to play like this, now that he's off of ping and now that he's in LA and with the team and he's got he's got his main support with him, we could be looking at the next big LCS prospect, and that really is the case. He has been phenomenal this year, genuinely MVP worthy, and now he's finally starting to level up and power up. This FlyQuest team could get very scary very fast. I don't want to give all the credit to Masu because Winsome coming in has definitely been an improvement. Credit to Kitong, I actually think he was really fine when he played with FlyC over the beginning part of the year, but Winsome is genuinely a really good player for this level, and he's showing that off here in this, in this series and in all of the series that he played this week. He really knows how to control a lane, he knows how to play enchanters, he knows how to play engagers. He's really flexible, and I think he's going to fit on this FlyQuest Challengers team really, really well, and even better as time goes on. These two are firing on all cylinders right now, and it's super fun to watch for those of you who are cheering for FlyQuest. Obviously, other players on this team played well. One of the players that I want to shout out, Yuji. I've been very critical of Yuji across 2023 so far. In my opinion, he's probably been the player on FlyQuest that I don't want to say is disappointed the most, but I had really high expectations for Yuji going into the year. I thought this could be one of the years that he really broke out as one of the best junglers in the league. He really hasn't done that in 2023, but this was a much better series. He clearly outjungled Mir in both of these games here, and that was very impressive. Mir is somebody who's been pretty stable for TLC, not exactly the best jungler in the league, but someone who's been relatively stable, I would say, overall for them, and I think he came out and just looked like the better jungler, and that is a really good sign. Hopefully having a bot lane that is pushing and is as strong as it is right now is going to only help out the rest of the players on this team. If this jungle mid can get to the level that we know they can play at, if top lane can continue to be a power role for them, FlyQuest Challengers could legitimately be one of the best teams in the NACL, legitimately, and I don't think it's really that far away. As for TLC on the other side, certainly some problems in this game. My dud of the series is going to go to Arrow in the bot lane. I'm honestly not super pleased to be giving this out. I was really hoping Arrow and Kimdown were finally starting to get to the page where they could just be a consistently solid bot lane in the NACL, but they're going to continue to have problems. Kimdown has honestly been the better of the two here. Arrow has really struggled, in my opinion, in the last few weeks. And I think that's highlighted by this series where he was just legitimately outplayed heavily by Masu in those bot lane roles. So Arrow's really going to need to step up. They brought him in for veteran presence. They brought him in for consistency, which is what he offered on Immortals last year, obviously before Proving Grounds when he got called up to the LCS. But, you brought him in because he's somebody who's been really successful at this level for a really long time. And honestly, he just really hasn't been all that fantastic this year. I'm not going to say he's been bad. He's not been like the bottom of the tier list, but they kind of brought him in expecting him to be top 5 in the role, and he just has been nowhere close to that, in my opinion. Definitely not in this series. The other player I want to shout out is Mir, who really didn't have a particularly good series here. Those two, I think, were definitely the big culprits of TLC not particularly performing well here. Mir just got out-jungled by Yuji, and honestly, I'm getting a little bit tired of feeling like I have to defend Mir. He's been the weakest player on TLC, and it hasn't really been all that close. I've honestly been pretty disappointed with him coming in. He had such a good year last year in OS. I was really hoping that was going to be able to translate to NACL. I thought the level was relatively similar, and it's just not, clearly. Like, Mir coming in has just not been on this level. Somebody who's been in the LCK, somebody who's played in OS before, played in a lot of different regions. I believe he's played in Latin America as well. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is somebody who has experience playing in a lot of different regions, very similar to another player like ADD, and it's just not really worked out for him. I think Arrow and Mir were definitely the two weak points of TLC in the series, and they've kind of been the two weak points of this team so far in 2023, but obviously they're still really good. APA is still a monster. He had a pretty good series. I think Kimdown is still getting better. I think Bradley's really solid in the top side. I just think if they can clean up some of the mistakes that they're making, some of these veterans are making, I think that this team is going to be a lot better. But FlyQuest Challengers, very scary. I mean, we're at the point where I'm now terrified to play this team if I'm coming playoff time. So, yeah, I don't really know what to say. This bot lane is going to be a tough out for basically anybody playing against them. We know that jungle mid has a super high upside, and Phillip is one of the more stable top lanes in the league. This could be a team that very sneakily rises to be hoisting that trophy by the end of spring, and, I don't think a lot of people are talking about that, but that could be a very real possibility for this team now. And then moving on to our final group of games here in the final day of Week 6. And it's a good group of games. It's a good couple of games to end off the week. We had series number 5 between TSM Challengers and CLG Faith. And TSM Challengers is able to take it 2-0. CLG Faith continues to look not so good and, quite frankly, probably like the worst team in the NACL. Especially with FlyFam being able to win a game on day number 2. CLG Faith's struggles just continue to pile up. But let's talk about TSM first and foremost, because a couple of their players played really well in this series. And the player that I want to highlight first and foremost is actually going to be Dragku in the support position. I actually think he's been underratedly good over the last few games. He hasn't been, like, the best support in the league or anything, but again, Kyle being excited about his support, what is super shocking about this? Dragku's just been really solid, I would say, for TSM. That bot lane has definitely been the driving point that they want to play through, especially in a lot of their wins, what with jungle mid really struggling, I would say, for a lot of these games, and that didn't necessarily go away for the series. Svenskeren had a pretty decent series. We'll get to Doxa in a bit, but Dragku, I think, was the driving force for a lot of the aggressive plays that they ended up making in both of these games, so he's going to be getting my player of the series. He gets to play alongside Wild Turtle, at least for one last series here. Spoiler alert, this is the last series that Wild Turtle, I think, will be playing in the NACL. Here in spring, it seems like Wild Turtle will be replacing Neo on the LCS stage. Obviously, he's already played some games as I'm recording this video, but Neo's going to be playing in the NACL as far as I'm aware, so this is Wild Turtle's last showing in the NACL, and I thought it was pretty good. Not exactly the most dominant performance in the world, like, I don't think he was, like, significantly leaps and bounds better than Aaron on the other side, who I actually thought had a pretty good series, but he was solid, and I think that's good enough for me to feel some confidence for Wild Turtle going into the LCS next week. But Dragku really was the standout member of that bot lane for me, even though the TSM bot lane was pretty good in this series. The other player that you have to shout out, and honestly the player that I think a lot of people are going to give player of the series to, is Hanser in the top lane. Really dominant games in both game 1 and 2. I think he led the team in kills in both games, but he just wasn't really involved in all that much. I still think Hanser's fantastic, and he dominated the top lane matchup here. We'll get to him versus Bajani, you know, once we get to the CLG Faith section a little bit more, but Hanser's just been really good. Easily the most consistent member of TSM Challengers, even with not really a lot of assistance coming out from the rest of the team. He's often isolated in 1v1s on the top side. He's been able to win a lot of them. Not only does he have pretty good scores, but he's been able to generate relatively strong CS leads and gold leads. And that's really good for a team that desperately needs somebody to be able to play through. If only TSM realized that they could go top lane and try to enable Hanser more. They realized that in game number 2, where they really got Hanser super far ahead, but, you know, by that point, obviously, the CLG Faith was pretty out of the series. I would say overall, Hanser has been really, really good for TSM Challengers over the course of the year so far, but him, Dragku, whoever you want to end up giving player of the series to, I think is totally fine here. The one player that I want to talk about on the side of TSM that wasn't particularly good was Doxa in the mid lane. He has really not been good in recent weeks, and I don't think that was an exception here. I don't think Town had a particularly phenomenal series, but I will definitely say that Town was better than Doxa in this series, which is crazy to say because TSM Challengers dominated both of these games. Well, not dominated. Game number 1 was relatively close, but Doxa just gives away so much of the lead that TSM is able to generate. And it's really frustrating to watch because I do think that he has talent and that he's a solid player. It's just the consistency problem with him. He's going to try to make some aggressive plays that his team is just not ready to follow up on. It does not feel like he is on the same page as a lot of the other players that he's playing with. And I understand that he was a last-minute replacement for this TSM Challengers team, but at the end of the day, he's had plenty of time to scrim and plenty of time to practice. We're 6 weeks into the season. He should be relatively comfortable with playing with these players by now, but it just doesn't seem like he is a very good fit on this team, and that might be a problem for them as they head into tougher competition further down the line. But for now, it didn't end up mattering. TSM was able to take the series. As for CLG on the other side, certainly some negatives, some positives as well, but we'll talk about the negatives first. Topside continues to be a negative for them. Bajani's going to get done of the series again here in the top lane. He is, in my opinion, the weakest top laner in the NACL right now. He just has not been able to stack up against any other tops. Obviously, Hanser had a really good series here. I'm not trying to take anything away from playing into Hanser, who has been really good and really consistent over the course of 2023, but Bajani has to show some level of fight in some of these matchups every once in a while. He's been able to stay even in some matchups when it comes to CSing, but oftentimes, even when he's not on tanks, he's playing frontline duty and he's dying way too fast, and CLG's just not able to team fight because of it. It's not entirely his fault. Damage dealers need to do a better job. But, you know, you gotta point out that he's just not been very good coming from the top side, and that's gotta be better. NXI had another pretty poor series. I really liked NXI as a player a couple of years ago. It doesn't seem like that player is really there anymore. It doesn't seem like he has the same kind of skill as he did a couple of years ago, which is unfortunate. Maybe it's the team, maybe it's the environment, maybe it's the mental right now. What with them losing so many games in a row, but NXI really is on a cold streak. Him and Bajani have been not very good for CLGF. I do want to point out Aaron, though, in the bot lane, who actually had a pretty solid game here. I would continue to say that this bot lane continues to be the strength of CLGF. It's only so much, right? They're not really winning games, but at the end of the day, at least they're staying relevant, and at least they're able to team fight behind Aaron in a couple of these games. His positioning is pretty good. The problem is just that there's not really a lot of opportunities for him to actually play the game, what with his front line and his supporting cast kind of getting deleted basically as soon as a lot of these fights start, but overall, CLG Faith is one of the worst teams in the league. There's really no other way to put it, if not the single worst team in the league. The team is now sitting at 0, 1, and 12. They have won one game across 13 series. That is really, really not good, and that definitely shows up in their play. Topside especially is really struggling. For TSM, though, just the right time to run into a team like CLG Faith and try to get your confidence back. You're going to have a new bot laner going into next week. I'm not entirely sure that's going to shake out. Neo is somebody who I think can play a little bit more aggressive than someone like Wild Turtle can, so it'll be interesting to see what they end up doing with that. But Dragku, Hanser in particular were really good here, and I'm excited to see what can happen from there. I'm still worried about jungle mid, especially in the long term, but at least they were able to get a win in a series here. And that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here in Week 6 of NACL, and it's a good one. It's two teams that are at the top of the standings right now. It was a matchup between Golden Guardians Challengers and Dignitas Challengers, and they do end up splitting 1-1. I really wanted to see if one of these teams was going to be able to take, the other down and really prove that they're the better team, but neither were really able to do so, although I will say Golden Guardians, I think, as a unit looking a tad bit better, but man, I gotta say it, player of the series, XU here was phenomenal. That game 2 Nidalee was game-breaking. I mean, you can talk about how Golden Guardians, maybe as a unit and maybe as a team, looked a lot better in their game 1 than Dignitas maybe did in their game 2, but XU put on his carry pants this morning and said, I'm at least going to win one game for my team. I love XU as a player. He obviously has that takeover instinct. I had him as my #1 jungler in the NACL going into the year, and while he hasn't necessarily lived up to that expectation this year, I don't think he's been, ridiculously far off. He's certainly in the upper echelons, and then he goes out and has games like this where it's just like, oh, I remember why I like XU so much, and why I think he's LCS ready, right now, and it's games like this. He was phenomenal in Game 2, and he absolutely deserved player of the series here, but the rest of Dignitas, not exactly living up to that moniker. XU was really good, but both of the players that I think were the weak points for this series were on Dig as well. My dud of the series is going to go to Hoon on the top side. I think Hoon's been fine. Honestly, I know I was very critical of Hoon in 2022. It almost became a channel meme how much I was talking about how ridiculous it was that Hoon was getting called up to the LCS and how big of a problem he was at that level, but for the most part, he's been pretty good. I think running into a team like Golden Guardians, he was going to be relatively susceptible to more pressure. They really haven't put a lot top lane, but their team fighting is extraordinary, and I think that is always going to put a lot of pressure on the top laners, especially in this meta, where they're kind of relied upon to be the frontline tanks, and I don't think Hoon was necessarily perfect in that role. He had some missteps in laning phase. I would argue that Concept was just the better top laner in this series, which, for as good as Concept has been over the last few weeks, isn't exactly the most ringing endorsement of how Hoon played, but generally speaking, I thought he was fine. The other player that I want to point out that wasn't so great on the side of Dignitas was actually Diamond in the support position. I thought Golden Guardians Challengers bot lane was pretty good in this series. I know we can talk about them kind of going back and forth, and I think in their win, Golden Guardians Challengers bot lane looked good. In their win, I think Dignitas Challengers bot lane looked good, but I would say that Diamond's game 1 was particularly not good, definitely kind of stand out not good, and it was definitely worth noting. But Hoon and Diamond, good players that maybe just didn't have perfect game #1s. XU was stellar, though, enough so where Dignitas definitely stayed in this series because of that. On the side of Golden Guardians, though, I actually think you're walking out of this feeling pretty good. You're going up against one of the best teams in the league in Dignitas, and you looked pretty solid doing it. Game 1 was a really nice win off the back of your jungle mid duo, honestly looking great. And Game 2 was pretty solid for them as well. Rosethorn and Young were definitely the two standout players. Young, not really a surprise, but what a week for Rosethorn. Honestly, one of his best, if not his single best week of the season so far. I think Week 6 is definitely going to go down as that for him because he was really solid. He went into XU in game #1 and looked really good. And even with the Nidalee getting super fed in game #2, he was actually able to stay pretty relevant and keep that game in check for Golden Guardians. Him and Young, I think, have developed a nice chemistry as the split has gone on. I've obviously talked about the carry roles for Golden Guardians being huge, and then Prismal in the support position. But Rose Thorn with another really solid week. Young continues to be the big standout prospect for Golden Guardians, in my opinion, when it comes to this team right now. And I'm just really excited for them because I don't think this organization has had this much excitement in a very long time, and it really does feel genuine. Not only is the LCS team performing really well, but you've got some really nice young prospects kicking around in the organization. It feels like everybody has gotten better over the last few weeks as well, and now you're going up against a team like Dignitas, who most people consider to be in the top 2 teams in the NACL, and you're drawing 1-1 and genuinely looking like the better overall team against them. It's just such a huge ringing endorsement for what Golden Guardians has been able to do. On the flip side, Dignitas has really started to worry me. Obviously, they still haven't lost a Series 0-2 this year, which is super impressive, but they almost have as many draws as they do wins, and especially in recent weeks, those draws have been piling up. They still are a pretty solid team, but maybe not the kind of dominant team that I think a lot of other people have been kind of saying that they are. I've always been a little bit lower on Dig as a whole. I think I was very hesitant to put this team into the top 2 earlier on in the year. They kind of proved that they deserve to be in there, but they're kind of starting to slowly fall out of favor with me. Too many draws. I need to see this team be more consistent and more dominant, but if XU plays like this, it's only a matter of time before the rest of the team steps up. All right, that is going to do it for my Week 6 NACL overview and analysis of all 3 days of action. I hope you guys enjoyed. Obviously, we put a lot of time and effort into these videos. Sorry that it's coming out a little late. Work has really been kind of killing me as of recent, and obviously I try to get to these videos as much as possible, but sometimes I can't record them in the day. They got to get recorded at night, and I live on the East Coast, so sorry for the late posting, everybody. But up on the screen right now, you're going to see the updated NACL standings after Week 6. Any ties will just be broken alphabetically, so no favoritism shown here. In the first column on the right, you're going to see my updated power rankings. In the second column, you're going to see how those have changed from last week to this week. Let's go over the biggest risers and the biggest fallers. So let's just go over the risers and the fallers and the power rankings in general. 1 and 2, we're going to say the same tentatively, because I think Dignitas has definitely looked a little shaky recently, but they deserve to stay in the top 2. But a new contender in the top 3 as the Fear jump up to number 3 here. 100 Thieves fall down to number 4 because of that, and we'll see Wildcard, the previous number 4, definitely fallen down quite a bit to number 8. But to round out the top 10 here, we've got FlyQuest jumping all the way up to number 5 here from number 10. I'm buying all in on this bot lane. I think this bot lane is legit, and I think Masu and Winsome are going to tear apart some teams that are not expecting it. Do not listen to this 9th place placing in the standings. This team is much better than that, and I think they're going to prove that. Number 6 is going to be Golden Guardians. They jump up from number 9. They looked really good this week. Hell, they could even go higher, but there are a lot of good teams at the top of the NACL right now. Number 7 is Team Liquid. They didn't have the best of weeks, and I still think they're pretty talented. Number 8 is Wildcard. They had a bad week overall. 0-4 is not good, but not even looking really all that competitive in those games worries me. They're going to drop down to number 8, and I think realistically, they could drop down even further if things continue like this. CLGC unfortunately drops down to number 9. They actually had a really good week this week, but I just can't justify putting Wildcard lower than them right now. I would still expect Wildcard to be able to find a way to take that win, but CLGC had a good week, and I still think they're pretty solid. Somewhere around 8 or 9, I think, is relatively fair for them, and then the rest of the standings are relatively the same. Evil Geniuses dropping down to number 10. They had a miserable week, especially Shaden in the jungle. You have Immortals, TSM, AoE not really moving, TLF not moving. But the bottom 2 are going to switch places. FlyFam jumping up 1 with a draw here, with a game win, and then CLGF not being able to take care of anything. They're going to fall down to that last place spot at number 16. But those are my power rankings. Let's talk about my player of the week and my dud of the week. My player of the week here in week number 6, it's going to go to Masu on FlyQuest. He was just phenomenal for this team. He's been really good for them all year long, but now that he's in building, like playing with the rest of the team, no ping, like he is really a superstar, and he's going to really be able to destroy this league. If we're looking back on Masu by the end of the year and saying like he was the breakout star of 2023, I'm certainly not going to be surprised, and this could be kind of the beginning of that. A really good week 6 from him. Other players I considered, APA on Team Liquid definitely had a really good week, and Darkwings on AoE. I think those were the 3 that I was really considering for Player of the Week, but Masu, in my opinion, definitely standing out just a tad bit more than the others. My dud of the week is unfortunately going to go to LJX on TLF. He's been thrust into a situation that clearly he just was not prepared for, and I think that's unfortunately showing on the Rift. He's just been the worst player in basically every game that he has played in at this level. I still think that this TLF team can be relatively interesting. I wish Mia, speedy recovery. I'm not, not privy to what's going on, but whatever's going on, hopefully you're doing well. But LJX, unfortunately, just not filling in at the level that they need him to at this moment. Other players that I considered, Shaden on Evil Geniuses did not have a very good week. And then Bajani on CLGF, who has just not had a lot of very good weeks up until this point in the season. But my dud of the week is going to go to LJX, and my player of the week is going to go to Masu. But that's going to do it. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below. Who am I too high on? Who am I too low on? Who's your player of the week? Who's your dud of the week? I love to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback down in the comment section below. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button. It really does mean a lot to me. It helps me know you guys are enjoying the video, and of course, it helps out the channel a ton getting this out to more viewers. We put a lot of time and effort into these hour and a half, hour 45 minute long daily podcast videos that come out on this channel. So if you guys enjoyed it, it really would mean a lot to me if you hit that like button. And of course, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button. It really does mean a lot. It helps out the channel quite a bit. And of course, it gets you updates to the rest of the content that I put out. I don't only cover the NACL here. I cover all 4 major regions as well weekly. So if you're interested in that kind of content, hit that subscribe button. I promise if you like this video, you're probably going to like the rest of them as well. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.